Ya estamos grabando, ¿no? Tú vas a grabar, ¿verdad?
Sí, ya está grabando.
Bueno, tengan ustedes muy buenos días. Previo a dar inicio a la sesión del día de hoy, vamos a ceder la palabra a Vanessa, quien dará las instrucciones sobre el manejo de la plataforma para la traducción simultánea. Adelante, Vanessa.
Buenos días, tenemos disponible el servicio de interpretación simultánea para español. Si lo necesitan, en la parte de abajo de la pantalla van a encontrar un icono que dice interpretación y tiene forma de planeta. Solo tienen que hacer clic y escoger el canal de español para escuchar la interpretación si la necesitan. Good morning. We have simultaneous interpretation available into English if you need it. At the bottom part of the screen, you will see an icon in the shape of a planet. If you need the interpretation, you can click on that icon and choose English to listen to it. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Vanessa. Bueno, vamos a dar inicio a la sesión de hoy. Gracias a todos por su participación en esta segunda conferencia en vivo en el marco del programa del Fondo Newton Paulet como parte del programa de capacitación de una metodología de innovación para el trabajo sistémico basado en misiones, a fin de contribuir a la recuperación económica del país. El mismo que está a cargo del Instituto de Innovación y Propósito Público de la UCL, University College London. El día de hoy nos acompañará el señor Andreoni. Él nos hablará sobre políticas para la activación de la innovación. Andreoni es profesor de economía industrial de la University College London y gerente de investigación en el Instituto de Innovación y Propósito Público. Trabaja en organizaciones productivas y ecosistema industrial. Se desempeñó en varios consejos asesores, incluido el grupo de expertos de la OCDE sobre la evaluación de política industrial, el programa de movilización de conocimiento local del Banco Mundial para mejorar las estrategias de competitividad, el Comité de Asesor de la Unión Europea, el apoyo de la RIS-3 a las regiones rezagadas y la Iniciativa de Integridad Comercial del Reino Unido. Para dar inicio a la presentación de Antonio, Victoria nos dará unas pautas generales para la realización de la presente sesión. Adelante, Victoria.
Sí, buenos días con todos. Un gusto tenerlos en esta sesión. Nosotros tenemos la dicha de contar con su participación, y lo que queremos para asegurarnos que esta sesión sea lo más productiva posible es asegurarnos que todos puedan participar y que la información que sea brindada de forma correcta. Y por eso queremos que ustedes, por favor, todos silencien sus micrófonos cuando quieran participar, porque sí queremos que participen, lo hagan a través del chat, y en los momentos en que Antonio y su equipo les pidan poder alzar la mano o participar, por favor, háganlo. Y si tienen alguna duda técnica, siempre cuentan con nuestro soporte técnico de ATO, pueden escribir en el chat y ellos los van a asistir. En cuanto a la dinámica entre los grupos, por favor mostrar respeto a los otros participantes, aun si tienen una posición diferente a las que ustedes tienen. Y si tienen alguna inquietud muy puntual, pueden escribirnos a perunewton@britishcouncil.org, y eso sería todo. Muchas gracias a todos por estar conectados, y los animamos a también participar de las siguientes sesiones, que son las que ustedes pueden ver en pantalla. Tenemos 3 sesiones adicionales en lo que resta del mes. Gracias.
Gracias, Victoria. Entonces damos inicio a la sesión. Adelante, Antonio, por favor.
Gracias. I will start sharing my screen, if you allow me so. Yeah. Can you see my screen well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Thanks for the introduction, and Victoria and Diana, and thanks so much for everyone for being here today with us to discuss how to activate innovation policy. Before I start, I would also like to introduce Manuel, who is with us here, Maldonado, who is going to work with us today in this session. He will be very instrumental to make this session as interactive as possible. We will explain what we are going to do in the session in a few minutes, and I hope will give us a chance to share experience, knowledge on this important topic. Let me start my lecture by linking back to what Mariana Mazzucato has covered in her first session of this executive training. And as you know, Professor Mazzucato has been working on mission-oriented innovation policies. And the idea, the core idea behind their lecture has been really this opportunity to shift from a traditional supply side and vertical approach to an approach that favor missions, challenges, and try to drive innovation across sectors by thinking around systemic public policy intervention. Now, today we will try to think about how to move from this framework, from this approach, to something more concrete in terms of the set of instruments and, if you want, ingredients that enter into the industrial policy, innovation policy making. And we will do that by looking at different country experiences, but also we will look at how these instruments have been used. So we will try to focus on a number of implementation, governance principles and approaches. And in that respect, as you will see in a few minutes, we will involve you all in this process. Now, what Mariana showed you was a framework that has been, as you know, implemented in a number of countries, or at least has been used as a framework for further implementation of policies. And this approach is basically grounded around the idea that it is possible to start from setting up a political agenda around grand challenges and high-level missions, and then focus on the specific mission projects and programs that would allow to activate instruments, institutions to achieve these missions. And of course, we are now talking about this level here, which is the level of the intermediate step at which we will work mainly today. At this level, we are talking about instrument policy institutions, and these institutions are not operating in a vacuum. They're not operating in a space without specific companies, specific sectors, specific technologies. So what we will do is will be to discuss in the second part of the lecture also what are the typical challenges that we face when we use these instruments to transform these sectors, to build new ecosystems and to govern digitalization. Now, this second part will be the beginning of a broader discussion that we will continue in the executive training when we will engage more directly with digitalization, digital industrial policy, digital innovation. Now, in this schematic that Mariana used, for example, in the case of Chile, Mariana has looked at how the high-level mission of transforming traditional sectors and making them more sustainable and actually leveraging resources that are abundant in countries like Chile, but of course also in Peru, can actually require a mission-oriented framework. And she has already pointed out that a number of these initiatives will have to be cross-sectoral, because the problems that we are trying to address are themselves cross-sectoral. They cannot be limited to any specific activity or technology. And also she has stressed how these policies are going to create this journey from one activity to another, right? So moving from one initiative to another to try to activate all these different players at the level of sectors, cross-sectors, industrial system, cities, regions, and so on, in order to achieve the type of mission that has been set in the very beginning. Now, as I said, my lecture is going to be really looking at these two levels of the mission-oriented innovation policy framework. The first one is really what instruments and policies we are talking about when we try to change dynamics at the level of sectors, industrial systems, cities, regions, and so on, and how these are used in other countries in order to achieve the highest level of effectiveness of these measures. So the how and the ingredients is going to be the first part of the discussion. One of the key issues that we will identify as a success factor among several economists around the world is the idea that countries not only need to learn how to use specific instruments, but also needs to learn how to integrate them into packages of policies, which in many cases are interacting among each other. And this will raise a number of issues around policy alignment, governance coordinations, coordination of policies over time, assessment and measurement of monitoring and assessment of the effectiveness of these measures, but also issues around how budget allocation is structured in different contexts. And we will try to address all this complex set of implementation processes by looking at an instrument that we've been developed over the years and that has been adopted in a number of contexts, which will allow to flesh out a number of these problems, to visualize them in a clearer way. And here is where I will very much like to involve you all by inviting you to start sending us a number of information around policies, institutions, instruments that you think should be included, should be mapped out in this instrument. And you will see the instrument is quite clear in terms of showing both levels of complexity associated with implementation of policies, but also identifying specific policy areas for which many of you have great expertise coming from both, of course, the public and private sectors and having worked on these policies yourself. So this is an opportunity to map out the current landscape and identify gaps, identifying opportunities that have not been captured so far in the policy coordination process, and reflect on how these instruments could be further used to advance industrial and innovation policymaking in Peru. We will have a break, and during this break, you will have a bit of time to send over the chat your contribution to this matrix, and Manuel will work in the background collecting and harvesting all this information and populating the matrix, the instruments for mapping that we will use and we will introduce in the first part of the lecture. While we will do that, I will also move to discuss the specific implementation challenges that emerge in a context which is more similar to the Peruvian context in terms of a middle-income country. I spent many years working in South Africa and in other countries, middle-income countries, and I think there is quite a lot of lessons that can be learned in terms of both challenges, problems that have been faced in, for example, building up coalitions of interest around innovation in new technologies, innovation in digitalization, and so on. But also there are experiences that can be adapted, that can be reviewed in order to reinvent, innovate on the policy instruments themselves. Now, let me start with this first part of the lecture. And what I would like to do is to start from if you want, one of the key ideas that people have in mind when they think about industrial innovation policy. And especially in Latin America, I've been working in Brazil and in Chile, and often the conversation around industrial innovation policy has always used as a reference point the experience of East Asian countries vis-a-vis Latin America. And often the narrative that I came across has been the idea that the fundamental reason why East Asian countries were successful vis-a-vis using industrial policy vis-a-vis a number of countries in Latin America has been that in Latin America, there was the use of import substitution. So industrial policy has been associated with the idea of import substitution vis-a-vis the context of East Asian countries where they were mainly focusing on export promotion or export-driven industrialization. This is a narrative that has been quite powerful because it has been used as a key interpretative tool to explain what went wrong and what went right in different parts of the world. And as you know, the East Asian Miracle Report, which was an important document in highlighting and revamping the use of industrial innovation policy, was actually trying to pick up some of the lessons from the successful countries. Now, partially this narrative has been revisited, has been reconsidered over the years, because in fact, the reason why a number of countries were successful cannot be limited to a single set of instruments, but in fact is a much more complex story. And here is where the real contribution of this discussion comes from. If you look at the experience of countries who have been able to use industrial policy, is the experience of countries which not simply were using export promotion, but were integrating export promotion and import substitutions in very different ways. So in other terms, they were using complex packages of measures which were designed in order to interact with each other and create a set of complementarities, a set of synergies among different government institutions and government institutions with the private sector and companies. So in other terms, it seems that it's not really that Latin America got it wrong in using import substitution, but in fact, the problem is what was done alongside these measures and how much these were integrated with other type of instruments and other type of approaches. Another very well-known scholar, Ajun Chang, has pointed out how very often these instruments were used almost to achieve contradictory outcomes. So if you think about the use of free trade policies, but at the same time, export promotion combined with infant industry protection, so set of measures that would appear as contradictory, actually these measures were used and integrated organically to achieve outcomes that were meant, or they were thought at that time, being the major challenges that these countries were facing. Of course, there are, as Carla is mentioning, there are also other differences. And here, I don't want to reduce the complexity of country context and experiences and path dependency into a very simplistic narrative. What I want to highlight, although, is that even small countries, if we think about Singapore, or small, medium countries in terms of size of the population or domestic demand at that time, were able to use industrial policy in this approach in a relatively more effective way to achieve their results. And in fact, the idea that industrial innovation policy needs to be understood within a more strategic and holistic approach is also foundational to what Mariana Mazzucato has covered in her first set of remarks in the first lecture. So the idea that fundamentally, if we can improve our implementation and design of industrial policy and innovation policy, only if we move from an approach that is narrowly focused on pasting and copying instruments, but actually looking at instruments and integrating them given the country context in different ways. And of course, this also resonates with the emphasis on experimentation and use of instruments in a new way in the country context. Now, when we think about this idea of interacting packages of measure, the first question is, so what that means in terms of the policy design, policy implementation process. And here is where I would like to start going a bit deeper into the discussion of the value of this type of approach. Well, the first idea is that policy alignment is absolutely critical. And this is something that to a certain extent is often mentioned, but it's more difficult to implement than it is to just state. Policy alignment requires to think about how measures that cut across skills policy, and so education policy, innovation policy, technology services that institutions provide in the country, the energy policy and the infrastructure attached to that, the development finance and financial sector, the trade policy and the public procurement. So combining and thinking about at the same time measures that are supply side, measures that are like public procurement, more demand side, measures that are apparently connected to sectors that are disconnected, but in fact, they have much more in common than what we think. And we know that the reality of policy alignment is challenging because, first of all, we need to think about what are these relationships, how education policy and decisions in education policy, let's say, have implication in terms of adoption of new technologies, but also how policies that are related to procurement can have also at the same time impact in terms of innovation and creation of new markets. So in other terms, creating a theory of change which allows to explain how all these things can be potentially aligned or disaligned is a key starting point to understand how to adopt a more strategic and holistic approach to industrial innovation policy making. Now, the policy alignment, and here is another aspect that I would like to stress that is often forgotten, it's not simply about aligning things in a static way, but actually means aligning policies and making sure that policies remain aligned over time. So policy alignment has to be understood dynamically. And here again, there is a fundamental challenge. Very often, new instruments are introduced without taking into consideration how these new instruments interact with instruments that are already there, regulations, tax regulations, incentives, infrastructures, or allocation of funding. And as a result of that, by introducing new instruments, we create contradictions or frictions in the way in which the package of policies work. Now, the idea of policy alignment, both in static and dynamic terms, fundamentally is based on the concept that the sum is more than its parts, but also is not simply a technical exercise. It's not simply about spotting linkages between policies that matter. It's also a political and a governance exercise. As you know, very often the reason why policies tend to be disaligned is also due not simply to the fact that some linkages are not spotted or some opportunities are not really analyzed in the design process, but also are due to the fact that the budgeting process is often done in a silos way, right? Based on silos, not based on problems and solutions to these problems. As a result of that, lots of resources, especially when budgets are limited, tend to end up being extremely fragmented. And this fragmentation ends up affecting the alignment of policy instruments and funding allocation. Now, this is an important aspect. We will go back to this point later on, but it's something that I would encourage you to start thinking about, because rethinking the budgeting process around solutions could mean also creating opening space for different type of collaborative arrangement across ministries, across public and private institutions. And this leads me to the second problem here, which is, if we think about industrial innovation policy in a strategic and holistic way, then the problem is, what is the best governance or the most effective governance model that could be used to achieve coordination across different ministries, public institutions, agencies. Now, we are all familiar with a standard distinction between top-bottom vis-a-vis bottom-up governance models. And often this is associated with the degree of centralization in the policy process decision and where the funding fundamentally sits. These are just two options, and if you want, they have to be taught as two extreme options in along a line, a spectrum, which involve lots of intermediate governance models, or as often are called, multi-layered governance models. And as we will see later, countries which have been particularly effective in industrial policymaking are those that, in fact, have innovated on the governance models and have used more hybrid solution. As soon as you think about a multi-governance model, where you have different layers at the municipal, regional, state, supra-state level, then of course the problem is where functions, policy functions are allocated. And this goes back to the budgeting process. Are the policy functions that have been allocated at sub-regional level or regional level, are these backed up by enough and sufficient coordinated funding? This also brings me to the third axis, if you want, to discuss this problem of developing an holistic and more strategic approach to industrial policy, which is the problem of targeting. Mariana in her lecture mentioned that mission is a new way of introducing some form of vertical or selectivity, which is different from the one that was adopted in the 60s and 70s, and is also different from the more standard conventional idea of horizontal approaches. First of all, horizontal approaches, they are always, to a certain extent, selective in a voluntary and involuntary way. If you decide to invest in more education or more infrastructure, often people think these are horizontal intervention. But in fact, the type of infrastructure, or the type of education that you decide to prioritize will have a selective or disproportional impact in the rest of the economy. So we are sort of doomed to make decisions. We cannot leave the decision to be made by someone else, simply because in this way we lose the opportunity to be strategic about our choices. And as soon as we discuss about targeting and selectivity, the issue is what is the matter that we target or we select? Are we talking about picking winners or picking the willing? Are we talking about sectors? Are we talking about the overall industrial systems? Are we moving beyond industrial systems? Are we focusing on cross-sectoral technology platform? Now, all these questions are very important, because when you design an institution or a policy, having a clear target makes not only the policy more potentially effective, but also the monitoring of that policy and the impact of that measurable. It's very difficult to measure and assess policy that have a very limited or very confused set of targets. Now, we will come back to this point. What is emerging, and this is just an anticipation, what is emerging in terms of best practices is that many countries are adopting cross-sectoral intervention that focus on and target specific technology platforms that are critical to engage with processes of innovation and technological change in the modern economy. Now, I here introduce these three ideas, which are key concepts in industrial policy design. So we talked about policy alignment, we talked about governance coordination, and now we talked about policy targeting. Now, let's look at what is policy targeting and policy governance coordination and policy alignment means when we try to look at them all together. Because of course, the design process and implementation process will have all these three things combined. And this is where these tools comes to our support. This is a tool that was developed with colleagues at Cambridge University a long time ago in 2013, was then developed further later on as part of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University, and later was adopted by few governments and international organizations like the United Nations Commission for Trade and Development, UNCTAD. As you can see here, in one snapshot, we are putting together the three key dimensions that I discussed so far. So the governance models, the problem of policy alignment, and the problems of targeting. On the axis which describe these different policy areas in cluster of policies, we have a number of typical instruments that we are all familiar with in innovation and industrial policy. So we have innovation and technology infrastructure policies that look, for example, at typical basic research funding, various forms of support of technology services for companies, services to scaling up activities. Higher education and worker trainings or skills policies are also examples of that. Many countries also adopt policies that support investment in production capacity, so matching grants and instruments to increase investment in the scale of activities in the economies, to increase employment, to reach scale efficiency, but also initiatives like those that are now revamped and used quite a lot, like extension services to support companies in absorbing new technologies. Think about the integration of, for example, sensors to gather data in an IoT and an Internet of Things system. Of course, there is also finance and long-term finance, access to resources, and development, of course, of infrastructures and networks. And we will talk more about, in particular, digital infrastructures in the coming sessions. These are traditional supply side measures. There are also demand side measures. And here we are thinking about trade policy, of course, because trade policy is fundamentally shaping domestic market access and, of course, access to international markets, but also public procurement. And public procurement is one of those instruments and policy area that has known quite a strong reconsideration in the coming years, partially because public procurement can be used in a quite eclectic way. Can be used to create markets, can be used to create markets that potentially would not exist simply if we leave it to the market, but also can be used to coordinate effort among different innovators. Now, I think Javier has his microphone on. Would you like to ask a question, or is it more of a problem? Oh, thanks. Okay, because otherwise we get noise coming in. Now, all these different areas of policies are going to be implemented at different levels. As we know, we have different, as we discussed, different governance models. Some of them are going to be done at more national level, others at more regional level. And also they will have different level of targeting. And this is also important because, as we have discussed, this will have implication in terms of the way in which we identify the target of the policy and the actors, the stakeholders for that specific industrial policy. And of course, as I said, there is also an axis which is about policy synchronization. This is just a snapshot of a, if you want, an industrial policy package in a certain moment in time, but also there are policies that are developed over time. So you will find lots of challenges and problems there in terms of looking at different maps over time and how they evolve. And this is exactly the exercise that in one of the contributions I'm going to use for this lecture we have conducted. We have compared 6 countries' industrial policy packages And as you can see, this can be done simply by listing and identifying the different instruments that are in place, the extent to which they are run by regional or national authorities, when they are introduced and where eventually are changed over time, what is the agency or the ministry who is in charge of the implementation of these instruments, and finally, what is the funding allocated to them. This is an example of the application of this matrix which was done 3 years ago, actually 4 years ago, just immediately before the last administration in the US, which actually reflect what was the state of industrial policy at that point in time. Now, the idea here today is that you can start thinking about the use of instruments of this type to reflect, to map out what are the set of instruments in place in Peru, but also the extent to which these instruments are aligned or not, if the governance model that is used is effective in achieving the targets that have been set in the policy documents. So Manuel has already shared with you a version of this matrix in a format that is also in Spanish and that can be populated by yourself as well. And what we would invite you to do now is to start thinking, while I describe few country examples, start thinking about the experience of Peru in these different policy areas, and think about the governance models that is used, so that in the discussion part of the session, we will go through your inputs and we will try to start identifying what is missing or what are areas that we could work on in the future. As I said, for each of these countries, as soon as you use this tool, you will start finding very different set of configuration of the policy package. In some countries, there is much more, for example, policies at the national level, much less at the regional level. Some other countries have adopted more innovation policies, while others have focused on both innovation and broader industrial and energy and infrastructure policies. So the more the matrix is populated across all these different dimensions, the more you tend to see potentially a more holistic approach to industrial policy. But this is just the start of the story, because as soon as we identify these policies, we need to start thinking about how they actually work in combination with each other. So to give you an example, when I was working in the UK with the Technology Strategy Board and what was called the Business Innovation Skills Department, in the 2012-13, there was a big discussion around how to align industrial sectoral policies with the so-called A-grade technologies, which was the main initiatives on innovation policymaking. And the alignment between these sectoral and more traditional industrial policy with the other new technological innovation policy was critical to assess the extent to which the new industrial policy package in the UK was going to be effective or not. If we look, and you will have plenty of material to reflect on these cases, if we look at across these cases, we see that there are 5 implementation principles that emerge. The first implementation principle is that effectiveness depends on not only on the instruments in itself, can be very well designed, but if it is designed in a way that doesn't relate to the other policies or contradict other policies, the effectiveness is going to be damaged. We also see, and this is what I will do after this slide, we also see that you can use instruments which appear to have the same form, they are designed in the same way, but you can use them to achieve different functions. So the same institutions can be used for delivering technology services, but also to use, for example, public procurement instruments. So you can integrate forms and functions of policy instruments and institutions in different ways. We also find that countries that have been able to align better their policies, even when they had lower budget, they tend to be more effective. So the problem is not so much increasing the amount of funding, is to make sure that the funding are not fragmented and are as much as possible aligned and try to achieve the same outcome. Also, we find that the policy targeting has been, as I already mentioned, increasingly becoming a matter of understanding changes in the ecosystem and the industry. As we will discuss later on with digitalization, what a sector is and the boundary of that sector is something that it's increasingly difficult to define. So targeting needs to reflect these changes. And finally, we also find that across these country cases, the governance models matters a lot. And the more governance models are hybrid, the more it is possible to achieve higher level of policy alignment. Now, these are still principles. Let's look at some of the ingredients if you want. This is more about how the cake is made, but what gets into the cake, what gets into the process itself. I will focus on two clusters of policies here. We do not have time to go through all of them, but two clusters of policies are particularly important, and you can think about them as a starting point for the exercise as well in terms of what is happening in Peru. And here, the first set of cases I would like to bring in is related to the support that countries are providing to technological innovation and technological change. We find a number of intermediate technology institutes like the Fraunhofers, like the Kosetsuchi Center in Japan, but also initiatives of new centers which are working on mission-oriented policies like the Genome Initiative or the Robotics Center in the US, which are critical and provide not simply incentives, but provide services. So the provision of services as a technology strategy is particularly relevant here, because incentives in a context where there are companies which might not be very competitive, or where there is a quite fragmented industrial system where there are very few big companies and many small, medium enterprises. Well, if you miss those medium enterprises and those small enterprises are too weak, then the problem becomes how to reach them out, and reaching them out might be more effective by using services, technology services, more than creating small incentives and a package of fiscal incentives. And this is what you find in the case of, for example, Germany, where you have a plurality of institutions who are actually providing technology services in scaling up technologies, in standardization, in testing, in data analytics, and so on and so forth. And this is also what we find increasingly countries like the US, which have been experiencing processes of the industrialization. A way of reverting that industrialization has been exactly trying to rebuild those set of institutions that provide a number of services which are more classical industrial policy services, like, for example, extension services in manufacturing. Why this matters? It matters because lots of the innovation that we are interested in, which can cut across many sectors, often rely on technologies which are developed not simply in a research lab, but also are developed and customized in the production shop floor. So being able to have an infrastructure that supports both research and development activities, but also the adoption, integration, customization of these solutions is particularly important. What is interesting is that many of these institutions have also worked in tandem with other institutions which works actually in a different policy area. But in fact, they provide similar type of functions to support. The policy area I'm referring to is the industrial finance area. So if you think about a company needs industrial finance as much as, especially if it is a small, medium enterprise, needs access to a number of technology services to invest and then scale up this technology and then reach markets. This is why industrial finance and the thinking around industrial finance can be highly complementary and coordinated with technology services type of traditional instruments. And this is what we find in the case of the SBIR program in the context of US, and we find the case of Germany when we look at the experience of the KfW, the Bank for Reconstruction, which has played a key role in the energy transition. Now, many of these experiences can be also found across many other countries. And this is a report which uses this methodology from the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development and extend this analysis to countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Rwanda, Uganda, and a few others. So this could be an interesting set of further examples around instruments that have been used across also other middle-income countries. We will go back to some of these instruments in the very last part of the lecture with focus on South Africa, Brazil, and China, where big emphasis has been put into trying to address the problems related to technological absorption and technological scaling up. Now that we have seen all these different experiences and we have started engaging with these principles around the how of industrial policy making and the ingredients that enter into it, we have an example of a matrix that could be used to think about the case of Peru. And this has been also shared and translated in Spanish. So you can start thinking about what at the moment is done in Peru in these different policy areas, and more importantly, to what extent in designing these policies, policy alignment has been taken into consideration. In order to do so, and in order to have a bit also of a break, I'll propose to have a 10 minutes break. We'll be back at 2:30 UK time and in 10 minutes your time. And after the break, hopefully we will have a number of inputs that Manuela will start using to populate these instruments. And I will move to the discussion of what happens when we try to implement these instruments in a context which is the typical example of a middle-income country context. And there I will refer to a number of specific challenges and specific responses in terms of instruments that middle-income countries have put in place. So thanks everyone, and we reconvene in 10 minutes.
So Antonio, how do you feel about this, the first section of your presentation? You are on mute.
Hi, Victoria. I think we are doing fine with time because the second part of the lecture is much shorter, so we will have at least 20 minutes for discussion.
Okay, great. Okay, good. Do you need? I know that Manuel is working on this, but do you need any support from our side? I asked because Diana, she was asking if you needed.
No, I think for the exercise, Manuel is going to pick up. People will have time in the second part of the lecture as well pick up a number of examples here, and then we will look at them in the matrix tool.
Okay, okay. Because there are some comments, and maybe I don't know if Kate is there. How are you gonna do with the pending questions of Mariana's session? So maybe it would be good that in these breaks or in other sections that you consider are more appropriate, you could discuss some of the pending questions from the sessions we have, just to know if that is possible, so that people see that if the answers to their questions cannot be given the same day, at least they are considered for the next.
Of course. Yeah, the idea is to start collecting all these inputs and also questions that we will pick up again in a second stage.
Great. Yeah. Great. I can see that, for example, Jorge Chata, he has commented he was previously in the Ministry of Production. I think Efrain is there, and he's from the International Labor Organization. Well, we have other people who are participating, and they are joining now too, since it's 9:25 here. So I think it's good that they are joining during the break. So it's important. Okay.
Excellent.
A todos los participantes en línea los incentivamos y y agradecemos sus participaciones. Por favor, continúen escribiendo en el chat. Como pueden haber escuchado ya, el equipo de UCL va a estar tomando todos sus comentarios en cuenta, y los que pueda, y las respuestas que puedan brindarles el día de hoy se las darán. En caso contrario, van a utilizar las siguientes sesiones para ir compartiendo la información que consideren se alinee más a lo que ustedes están solicitando. Sí, muchas gracias a todos.
Excellent. I think we are getting quite a lot of interesting inputs from many of you. So thanks for, I can see quite a few references to policy instruments, but also references to specific challenges, especially in terms of translating these instruments into real implementable and fundable activities. And this is, of course, one of the big challenges that in a number of countries governments face in terms of moving from simply developing policy documents and embedding actually instruments, measures into specific institutions. So I will restart with the last very few points that I wanted to make around how these complex process of industrial policy making, design, implementation, alignment, coordination, how this actually also gets stuck in a number of countries as a result of specific challenges that these countries faces. And here I build on some work in particular done with colleagues at University of Johannesburg and colleagues across other institutions working on specifically middle-income countries, resource-rich economies, issues around, for example, the mining value chain and issues around how to bring innovation in a number of these sectors. And what is clear from these studies is that when you try to use these instruments, governments face four key challenges when the government is a middle-income country government, which means that the structure of the economy and the characteristics of the economy makes quite difficult to achieve a number of outcomes, partially because the structure of the economy presents a number of problems itself. Now, what are these type of issues that emerge? First of all, someone in the very beginning was mentioning about the size of the economy. In many activities and sectors and technologies, we have been seeing an increasing degree of concentration and also degree of concentration in markets. So this poses a first initial problem, how to break into the global economy. The second problem is how to actually break into the global economy by developing a number of relationships with both global value chain, but also innovation chain. And we will discuss that much more when we look at the role of digital platform in the development of sectors like tourism, for example, but also the role of digital technologies in the development of sectors like medical device or mining equipment. Now, the linking up into global value chain is made difficult by the fact that the source of knowledge and the sources of technologies are often difficult to absorb and difficult to transfer into the domestic economies. And in particular, this is the third challenge, we see lots of problems in making sure that not only the economy is linked to the global market, but actually that these linking up also result in a linking back, which means that the domestic economy, the supply chains within the economy are linked into the global market or are able to capture opportunities from these markets. And there's implication in terms of domestic value addition, in terms of employment, in terms of innovation. And finally, the fourth challenge that is structurally typical in a middle-income country context is the fact that very often governments are trying to keep pace with technological change. And in keeping pace with technological change, they face specific challenges in terms of allocating funding along the innovation chain. Let me just give you a quick snapshot of each of these problems. Well, the first one, when I talk about concentration, we are in a context, if we think about, for example, the industrial manufacturing sector, where still level of R&D are the highest across countries. This is a sectors where high level of concentration have emerged and new giant players have picked up. if you look at China, for example, China gained 5% world market manufacturing value added shares over the last 25 years. We also have a number of other middle income countries who are competing to enter into a number of sector and more than sector controlling technologies that are relevant to create value and capture value along value chains. And if we think about the value chains, we know that many industrial innovation strategies have in the background the idea that we would like to see product upgrading, process upgrading, forms of functional upgrading, and so on. So different forms of upgrading along the value chains. For those of you who are not familiar with the smiling curve, this is a very well known, adopted instrument to look at how value is distributed along different activities in the value chain. And so linking up into global value chain and upgrading, it's very much about engaging with the structure of these value chains and trying to find pathways to upgrade the domestic economy and the domestic companies. Ultimately, what you would like to achieve is what other countries that in the past have been successful have achieved, which is actually finding ways to not simply be connected with the global economy, but actually building up domestic industrial ecosystems where public institutions of the type we discussed before, intermediate technology institute, technology transfer centers, incubators, universities, and so on, work in a synergistic way with the domestic supply chain. And these are places that some of you might recognize. Of course, one is the classical case of where the Industrial Revolution started in the UK, in Lancashire, but also places like the Emilia-Romagna region in the north of Italy, which was a model of development of industrial clusters since the 70s and 80s, and the most recent clusters of countries who have been successful in creating this local ecosystem, which include the Silicon Valley of the US and the Silicon Valley of China, which is Shenzhen. I'll close my presentation by looking at, in particular, the keeping pace with technological change challenge, because a big emphasis here is on activating innovation policies. Very often, the problem of allocating funding along the innovation chain is due to the fact that there are lots of gaps there. This is a typical representation of different stages of technologies, from research down to commercialization. And often, R&D policies tend to focus on one side, which is basic research. And companies tend to be more focused on down the stream in picking up innovation coming from universities and other research centers to actually develop products and new processes. So the funding tends to be at the start and the end of this process, but very often there are gaps in the middle. And in fact, this is what many of the instruments I was referring to before, like the Fraunhofers, like the National Network for Manufacturing Innovation in the US, or the Kosisushi Center in Japan, this is what they try to do. They try to fill the gap between these different peaks of funding. In countries like China, Brazil, but also South Africa, this problem has been particularly severe in their different historical phase of industrialization and innovation, partially because there is a gap in the middle, partially because their level of funding, both upstream and downstream, have not been able to compete with international levels. So what they have done, have been developing, and this is another contribution for this lecture that has been translated for you, they've been actually looking at solutions along the innovation chain to support through funding and through services the development of innovation. And here there are three models here that are detailed and documented in some of the material. One which is the so-called InnoFund in China. By the way, Huawei as a company received an InnoFund in its initial stage of development. And InnoFund has proven to be a very successful model in China. The Embrapa case in Brazil that you might be more familiar with because it's very well known in terms of technology services in the agribusiness and biotech. And finally, a matching grant scheme in South Africa. When you look at all these different models, you realize that very often many countries have these instruments in place. But the design of these instruments matters a lot in terms of effectiveness. And this brings me to the discussion around the exercise that we have just started. And again, I'm very pleased to see so many inputs coming here that we will now start discussing, which is the fact that we will find in many countries on the paper many of these instruments. But the problem is how these instruments have been designed to achieve the targets and the objectives that governments have in place, and how they've been framed, as we have seen, into a package of policies that is coherent, that is aligned, that can achieve higher impact. So here we can now move to address in the discussion this question, which is how we can activate innovation policy in the context of Peru, given the existing policy matrix or the policy package that is in place, given the way in which some of these have been designed. So in some cases, we might talk about realignment of instruments, redesign of instruments, or changes in the governance models or budgeting allocation, and also identifying areas where instruments have never been implemented or have never been designed for. So where there is a clear gap in the policy. So I'll stop here, and I will like to start the discussion with Manuel giving us a very quick introduction, and feel free to go in Spanish or in English as you prefer. I can understand Spanish being Italian, but I find it difficult to give a lecture in Spanish, so apology for that.
That's okay.
Manuel, would you like to give a quick introduction to that, and then we will invite people who have presented some of these inputs to just discuss that.
Do you want me to share my screen and share?
Yes, yeah.
All right. It's not the best version, but it's the best version I can do right now.
This is work in progress. Yes, yes.
Yes. So people have been mentioning, and one of the main subjects is that as a country, we don't have a main policy surrounding industries. So there are a lot of efforts that are not coordinated. As you can see, we have Concitec that works more mainly in innovation, maybe in other areas. We have some funds that are set to provide long-term financial capability to entrepreneurs. We also have like a strategy to develop some sort of clusters, and also a lot of organizations that work around capacity, production capacity. But as a whole, and that's one of the main takeaways of what people are writing in the chat, is that we don't have a clear industrial policy, and that is a problem. And also, a lot of people didn't mention something related to access to resources, energy, things that we might be working on. So that may be also a gap. So, but then we can continue the conversation with the other participants that want to intervene.
Thanks, Manuel. This was very useful. I think we can keep this shared just as a background for the discussion. Let's keep it on, if you don't mind.
Do you see it?
If you can put it in full screen, it would be better. Yes,
right.
As it was before.
I don't know what happens. Do you see it?
We can still see it, but it's not in full screen. But you can leave it as you like. Okay, that's very helpful. And it's very interesting to see already where the majority of policies are located. So may I invite people who have been raising a number of questions to just now step in and actually raise their questions, their comments, and also reflect together on this matrix and where they see also cases of success in terms of policy alignment and where they see this not happening. Victoria, you might want to chair the discussion in terms of inviting people to join. You've been following the questions that have been raised.
Victoria C, right? Because Victoria Phillips is also. ¿Cómo están todos? Como les decía, la idea es justamente poder participar. ¿Tienen algunos de ustedes quisieran también comentar algo? Si así fuera, pueden alzar la opción o el icono de la mano para que puedan ser considerados y Manuel y Antonio puedan ordenar las participaciones. Pero sí, este es el momento en que podemos pasar del chat a alzar las manos y poder comentar. No sé
Sí,
si
hagan las preguntas que quieran. Acá con Antonio las va a responder todas, así que, por favor, se han estado tan participativos en el chat, igualito ahorita con el micrófono abierto.
Sí, yo veo que aquí están comentando Pedro, Carla, Víctor, Verónica, Efraín, Luis. Los invitamos a todos a alzar sus manos. Yo voy a estar viendo la pantalla. Si quieren, yo puedo hacer ahí, entre Manuel y yo podemos identificar el orden de quienes alzan sus manos para poder darles el pase. Paul, por ahí vi que Paul había estado comentando. Tal vez, Paul, siendo parte de Concitec, quisieras comentar algo y luego le damos el paso a Carla. Paul.
Hola, ¿cómo están? Voy a hacer un repaso rápido porque, digamos, el ejercicio me pareció súper interesante, ¿no? Habiendo tantos participantes. En el pasado también hicimos un ejercicio similar, sobre todo con el Ministerio de la Producción, y de hecho compartí un PPT que también va a ayudar. Ese es otro tipo de organización. A ver, algunos temas. Primero, en el tema de demanda, faltarían las compras públicas de innovación, que eso lo viene impulsando el Ministerio de la Producción, ¿no? En el tema regional, en realidad, Perú es muy centralizado. Digamos, no habría mucho en el tema regional más que las agencias regionales de desarrollo. Creo que es una iniciativa bastante concreta a nivel de región. Y también ahí está involucrado también los centros de innovación tecnológica, los CITES, ¿no? Pero los CITES yo lo pondría, digamos, en la parte de empresas y sectores manufactureros.
Perfecto.
Tanto en lo regional y lo nacional. Después hay un conjunto, actualmente Concitec y Fondesit está integrado en una sola. Fondesit es la agencia, digamos, que implementa los fondos concursales que diseña Concitec, pero sería una sola. Y el alcance de los instrumentos financieros es más de corte transversal. Y eso tiene que ver un poco con el tema de infraestructura, con el tema de educación.
O sea,
Está
¿te refieres a
abordándose
que
ahora el tema de vinculación a las empresas.
ya que Concitec podría ser un espectro un poco más amplio, o sea, hacia educación, hacia capacidad y además de recursos?
Sí, es que a veces manejas, por ejemplo, un instrumento de investigación aplicada, pero le vas teniendo el tenor a temas de empresa, el tema de comercialización, vas avanzando en eso, ¿no? No es solo investigación de por sí.
Perfecto.
O sea, con un instrumento, es justamente lo que dijo Antonio, o sea, con un instrumento le empiezas a reorientar y empezar a focalizar hacia donde tú estás buscando. Digamos, y lo más valioso va a ser, me imagino que después de esto, verlo más a detalle, ¿no?
Sí, claro.
Y ahí entramos a otra discusión de la eficiencia de cada instrumento, etcétera, y sobre todo el alineamiento. En el tema de alineamiento, pues es una discusión actual. Actualmente se viene discutiendo sobre la gobernanza del Sistema Nacional STI, justamente por eso, y de la optimización de los recursos para promover la STI. No, yo creo que me quedo acá para dar oportunidad al resto de nuestros compañeros.
Muchas gracias, Paul. Creo que seguía Carla.
Carla, sí.
Hi everyone, good morning. Hi Antonio, thank you so much. I have a question. This is a more general question. Do you have any a specific example of policy alignment from any other country that might have seen to be successful? So the first one that comes to my head is the one in India, and India created this supra ministry called Niti Aayog. And they sort of tried to have this policy alignment, but my question with that is that it was so centralized because everything came from Delhi to the rest of of the country that is huge. So for me, it's like, does it really count as a successful story if it's super centralized and if everything is coming technically from the capital? But then you have the other side of Peru, that there are so many divisions within the government that is super difficult to align them. So if you have maybe an example of something successful or the closest thing to success, I'd be very thankful.
Envíeme un correo, por favor, si no me escucha.
Thanks, Carla. Let's pick up a few questions so that we are able to, and then I'll do a round of responses if you don't mind, so that we give more options to people.
Hola, si todos podemos apagar nuestro micrófono, se está filtrando un sonido, no sé exactamente quién es, pero si todos podemos asegurarnos de estar con el micrófono apagado. Y en la lista tenía a Efraín.
Los procesos, ¿usted quién es? ¿Usted es la coordinadora?
Efraín.
Sí, sí, muchas gracias.
Antonio was answering Carla's
por la oportunidad, pero hay un sonido.
Sí, no sé de dónde está viniendo, discúlpanos.
El host de la llamada puede mutear a la persona.
Sí, creo que ya está.
Ya, ok. Sí, me gustaría comentar rápidamente sobre dos instrumentos que me parecen absolutamente relevantes en esta discusión. Ya el anterior colega ha comentado sobre la importancia de los CITES, ¿no? El Instituto Tecnológico de la Producción y su red CITES me parece que son dos instrumentos que habría que mirar a profundidad y cómo pueden convertirse en una suerte de brazos articuladores en los territorios para promover productividad, empleo, trabajo decente, etcétera, innovación, articulando al ecosistema de actores que están en los territorios. Yo creo que ese es un tema que habría que mirar con detenimiento, porque si bien se están haciendo ciertos cambios en las competencias y funciones de los CITES, habría que ver que los CITES puedan integrar su trabajo fuertemente a las cadenas de valor en los territorios. Esto por un lado. Y por otro lado, a nivel del país, hay una experiencia que desde la OIT nos parece interesante, que son las mesas ejecutivas. Las mesas ejecutivas son para nosotros una tecnología para promover políticas de desarrollo productivo, porque buscan resolver fallas de coordinación, que es un tema que se ha tocado en esta charla, y estas experiencias intentan operacionalizar la cooperación entre los actores claves públicos y privados. O sea, son instrumentos de gestión pública que están ayudando a identificar y buscar eliminar cuellos de botella que afectan la productividad y la capacidad de generar empleo en algunas cadenas de valor. Entonces yo creo que esto es importante, y estas herramientas también se están enfocando en la co-creación y en la implementación de soluciones, que es un poco lo que nos han hablado. O sea, más que enfocarnos en silos, hay que buscar resolver problemas. Y justamente las mesas ejecutivas que se vienen promoviendo desde el Ministerio de Economía y Finanzas, creo que es un instrumento que hay que ver con mucho detenimiento en este mapeo, ¿no? Entonces, hemos visto algunas experiencias concretas donde se han establecido un objetivo de largo plazo. Se hizo una corta lista para generar o identificar problemas y luego afrontar soluciones, pero más desde el nivel nacional. Por eso decía que quizás el complemento entre mesa ejecutiva y dándole un rol más articulador a los CITES podría ser un modelo interesante a trabajar en el país. Me quedo ahí, gracias.
Gracias. Antonio, do you want to answer both
yes,
of the comments?
I think these are very important. They are very much related questions. First of all, also thanks for the first comment. I think it's very important to understand how these technology institutes are also rethinking themselves in view of capturing the opportunities of digitalization. And this has been happening in many countries where, for example, in the past, many of these technology institutes were sector focused, and they're now becoming much more technology focused, which doesn't mean they stopped being selective, but they try to support technologies and technology platforms that cut across different sectoral value chains, and they can be relevant for them. So if we think about things like tourism, for example, there might be technologies there, and in fact there are, that are relevant in sectors that apparently are completely disconnected. And this is an important exercise to do. We've done, for example, this work in South Africa, looking at the digital industrial policy there, and looking at how health, the health sector, the mining sector, the mining equipment sector, and so on, how they could be supported differently from the technology point of view and technology service point of view. And we will discuss that more as a case next time. The other two questions are very important here, but are more related to the governance model that is used. And I think Carla was referring to examples of bodies that have been embedded into governments under presidencies or under prime minister's offices to achieve these outcomes. My assessment of this is that often these type of bodies have been created, but the fundamental budgeting processes have remained unchanged. If the budgeting processes remain unchanged, while you identify opportunities for coordination, then it's very difficult to implement them. Because as you know very well, ministries and public organizations tend to work in terms of protecting the budget, right? Different type of budget lines are contested in the government process. So it's important to think about how partnership between government institutions can be built around different way of doing budgeting. And this could be then an instrument to make these coordination bodies like the one that Carla was referring to more effective. And I think this is what has been the difference between the experience of coordination bodies like in Korea and Japan, and more recently in Thailand and Malaysia, vis-a-vis the experience of India and other countries. The other point that was raised in the last set of comments is really about this issue of also understanding at what level to operate, right? And here I'm very curious to know more about how some of these institutions are specializing their efforts at the regional level, not only at the national level. And here some important remarks related to the first comment. I think we need to think carefully about how it's possible to actually specialize some of these institutes also in relation to places and differences between places, because that can give much more grounding into the use of these instruments. We will have more chances to discuss, especially in the small group, number of these issues in more detail, also in terms of the specific industries we will look at. But I see quite a few other comments coming. So Manuel, would you like to pick some or give the floor?
They're talking about one of the big problems, for example, Veronica, if you want to put your comment or just say it here.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Antonio, thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to point out that we have a lot of problems, not in the design of policies. We have a lot of policies designed in very, very intense policy designers, but we don't implement the policies because we don't have this policy alignment, and all the silos in the budget is also a problem. That we have. I couldn't say that we don't have enough money for research and innovation, but we don't use the money very well. But I think that the most important problem is how to choose. We have a lot of problem making the decision of choosing for some sectors to develop. So the policies are go through all the sectors and all the possibilities. We have all the regions, and we cannot choose a micro region or a cluster of development. And we have a lot of problems there. I don't know how to solve this because this is also political, and we have a lot of problems in the Congress, etc., in choosing which is the way that we develop. For instance, we have mining in the south of Peru, but we cannot develop there much because it's only the destruction of the products, but we don't have another chain values involved in this production, or we don't have, for instance, a policy that can improve the life of the people who lives around. So we have a lot of problems also in agriculture. We have agriculture policies, but we don't organize which chains of value we are going to pick for this for get intensive in the innovation policy in this sector. So we have a lot of problems of the government. I don't know if you have any ideas of how can we solve this.
I think what I can do is the next session that we're going to have on digitalization is going to be a discussion around digital innovation chains and opportunities for more granular way of combining different interests and different stakeholders around initiative of this type. I think you're absolutely right. In many cases, these alignment are political problems more than technical problems. It is also true that many countries face this type of political problems. They are not unique to Peru, but they find ways to actually address them by actually focusing on a design process that assess the feasibility ex ante in the implementation. Very often the design is done in a way that doesn't factor in what is the challenges of the implementation itself, including the political economy challenges. So we have done some work in terms of looking, for example, in a quite political complex sector, as you know, mining in South Africa, to look at what type of master plan to develop there in order to realign interest among different stakeholders along the value chain so that the design can be more effective, because the implementation can be stopped by the type of problems that I mentioned, right? You know, challenges in the value chain, the markets, and so on, reaching competitiveness. But also, if the design was done in such a way that actually pull apart actors more than pulling them together and crowd in investment, then can be very problematic. Right? So, for example, I'll give you a very concrete example, but we will go back there. You know, lots of localization policies to now in the case of data, but in the case of technologies or local content requirements, can be designed in different ways to achieve that outcome of more domestic value addition, right? The traditional approach might not necessarily achieve the result because tend to be quite contested, right? If we think about, for example, the mining equipment value chain and the metals mining value chain. While more original ways of using trade policies or combining more flexible instruments that allow companies to achieve these parameters by doing different things, including developing communities, including boosting innovation investment or linking up domestic firms into their supply chain, global supply chain, could deliver some different results. I think this is where it's difficult to make general statements because, as you know all very well, working in government, these are at the end very specific problems with very specific actors. And this is also what Kate Roll in the next session will discuss, how we do system thinking, not from the point of view, as I've done today, of policies, but also from the point of view of interest, right? Interest players, system thinking around different social groups, different organizations. So this is your point is extremely well taken, and you're absolutely right. And I hope I will, as I said, promise to start that discussion next time on the digital side, and I will use digital technologies as an area for investment in innovation to address your specific question.
Perfecto. Thank you so much, Antonio. I think
I'm conscious of time, so yes. I don't want to take more than.
Yes. So thank you, everybody. I don't know, Victoria, how do we proceed from here?
Yes, no, we were really happy to see that people were participating. Muchas gracias a todos por su participación activa. Esperamos puedan unirse a las siguientes sesiones. Como les hemos dicho, tenemos una el 9, el 7, el 9 y el 16. La idea es que puedan conectarse y seguir estas conversaciones y estas dinámicas. Sí, y ustedes tienen ya el link del evento, igual yo se los comparto en el chat. Y eso sería todo. Muchas gracias por su participación, ya se les estoy enviando.
Thank you everybody.
Entonces, contamos con su participación. Hasta luego, gracias.
Bye. Bye. Antonio, they're waiting on the other Zoom for the enrichment.